Michelle, thank you, and welcome to everybody. I'm Jeff Gedmin with American Purpose. We have a special hour of music in store for you. As a quick scene setter, I'll tell you, I never tire of this quote, actually something I heard British composer John Tavener once say before he passed away, sadly, just a few years ago. In an interview, he was asked that when he was not composing, what kind of music he likes listening to. And I think most of us expected an answer like Baroque or cello or vocal or jazz. And he paused and he said, well, I love any music that offers me a different way of thinking about things or experiencing things. I thought that was a creative, imaginative sort of reply. And I think that, in my view, music doesn't need an explanation or any kind of utilitarian purpose at all. It's useful in times like these when, I'll say, many of us get stuck in our silos, to have something that helps us refresh or reset or stimulates or widens our lens in a different sort of way. So today we have two special guests and friends of American Purpose with us, Joe Horowitz and Angel Gil-Ordóñez. I say that they're friends because one of the great pleasures of American Purpose this last year, this, concludes this 3-day virtual conference marking 1 year American Purpose, is the friendships and the colleagueship and the alliances that have formed and are forming, and that really couldn't have been predicted 12 or 14 or 16 or 18 months ago. Joe is a writer and teacher and commentator and producer of music. He's a former music critic for the New York Times. Angel, you are a Spanish-born conductor and a teacher and a commentator, and both of you are co-founders and leaders in your respective roles of PostClassical Ensemble, a group based in Washington, D.C. that does all sorts of creative, I think, energetically imaginative things that help us a lot in the community here and beyond. Today, the idea is to listen, to talk, and to ask, and I think the emphasis is going to be on listening. And we have the integration of music and film and indeed politics. It's a rich program. We'll keep it to 1 hour. I promise to keep everybody on time. And Joe, you and I agreed that we would listen first and talk second. And we're going to begin with an iconic film about the Mexican Revolution with music by Silvestre Revueltas, 1899-1940, by the way. But let's get right into listening and then have some questions for you and for Angel. Michelle, over to you if we're able to play this clip. Thank you, Michelle. And Joe, then you first. We're watching and we're listening, and we'd be happy to have a little bit of historical and political context. Tell us what we're watching and listening to.
Here's a great political film, 1935. The cinematographer is Paul Strand. The composer, Silvestre Revueltas, who I would call the supreme political composer of concert music produced in the Western Hemisphere. It's an act of propaganda, and it's a great work of art at the same time. These are the workers storming the bastions of power. They've just united in order to do so. And in the course of this film, we see their exploitation, the way that they've been oppressed and divided, and then this call to action at the end. And I often juxtapose, I should mention, this is a DVD produced by PostClassical Ensemble. This is not the original soundtrack, which is not very good, from 35. This is a new soundtrack with PostClassical Ensemble conducted by Angel Gil-Ordóñez. And this is, I think, one of the supreme examples of the combination of music and the moving image in the history of cinema. Of course, it's not very well known because it's Mexican, but it deserves to be. And it's an exemplar for us today when everybody is identifying the arts as instruments of social justice, which is a dangerous thing to do. You can produce great political art. We're not good at it in the United States. The Mexicans were really good at it. And people like Aaron Copland attempted to draw inspiration from Mexico in attempting to make political statements that were also artistic statements.
Joe, I want to come back to Aaron Copland in just a moment, and I want to draw Angel in too. But first, you said not well known because it's Mexican. Now, for many or most of us, when we think of the first part of the 20th century, the first 10 and 20 and 30 years, those first 2 or 3 decades, we think about Paris and Berlin and Vienna, of course. And so tell us a little bit about what was happening and why you just suggested why a body of music and composers like Revueltas have been so neglected.
I'm just making a list of the people who went to Mexico. It is like Berlin. It is like Paris. Langston Hughes went to Mexico. John Steinbeck went to Mexico. Paul Strand went to Mexico. Aaron Copland went to Mexico. Eisenstein went to Mexico. Why are all these people going to Mexico? Because Mexico was a place where artists mattered, where artists, Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, Chavez, they were, and by the way, Revueltas' family included one of the important muralists, Fermin Revueltas. It was a place, for whatever reason, where artists were helping to shape a national destiny and identity, the very thing that was not happening in the United States. And Copland memorably wrote home when he went to Mexico saying, I wish we had something like this in the United States where I feel we're working in a vacuum now more than ever. These Mexican artists were not working in a vacuum. You're muted, Jeff.
Thank you, Joe. Hold that thought, coming right back because we're going to continue with Aaron Copland and then we're going to hear some more music in just a few moments. Angel, can I ask you, it's a bit of a parentheses, but it's also central. So this particular composer, Revueltas, started, if I have it right, as, I think he came from a musical family, started with violin, but became a composer and conductor. Could you tell us a little bit, forgive this, silly sort of question. You know, a lot of people think that you conductors are people who wave your arms around and it sure must be a lot of fun. I suspect that your musical background is interesting. I suspect you started playing an instrument. And when you're tackling such a score, would you just briefly tell us what is involved, not just in the performance, but the preparation of the score and the rehearsal of the orchestra? But start with your background very quickly. Did you play an instrument?
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Jeff. Well, it's a great honor to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, my instrument is the violin. I started as a violinist, and I can tell you that, in my opinion, the best preparation to become a conductor is composition. I always say that composers have to conduct and conductors have to compose. This is the approach. When you write music, you have a complete different approach to the music that you are conducting. In the case of Revueltas, this is a really, it's Joe and I, one of our missions with PostClassical Ensemble is kind of being the advocates of lost causes. And Revueltas is one case. This is, in my opinion, the most committed composer to political and social justice I've ever met. As Joe mentioned, being, of course, a consequence of the Mexican Revolution, but he went to the Spanish Civil War. So at the time, we're talking about the 30s, somehow Mexico and Spain were focused for people looking for social justice. I mean, of course, the Spanish Civil War meant kind of the last hope against fascism in Europe. And what is very interesting about Revueltas is how he uses, what are the tools that he uses to become politically and socially committed to the music that he writes. Well, to me, the word that defines Revueltas is empathy and compassion. In his music, there is that, is empathy with the poor people, with the people that suffer. There is a very interesting parallel between Revueltas and Shostakovich. I feel that Shostakovich is the same analogy. People that really write music that resonate with those who are suffering. And I mean, how do you compose a communist score? I mean, how do you compose something that resonates with these people? Well, in the case of Revueltas, just the topics of his inspiration, just the titles of the works, redes, fishermen nets, batik, caminos, paths, esquinas, corners, things that are, the usual thing for the common people. Of course, using text of people that are committed to these problems. Nicolas Guillen, the Cuban poet, he wrote songs inspired in poetry by Guillen. And then in a more even extreme, interesting case, he uses instruments that are played by the common people, but the village bands, the trumpets, the clarinets, the double basses. So somehow, to him, using an oboe or a cello is kind of a bourgeois sound somehow. So I think he makes big statements in everything that he's writing. And to me, this is fascinating.
Angel, thank you. Thank you. We come back to Joe. Before we get on to the next bit of music, I want to talk at least for a minute or two about Aaron Copland. He went to Mexico. Of course, he went to Paris too. He studied with the great teacher of composition, Nadia Boulanger, but he was attached and he was influenced very much by Mexico. And you, Angel included, but you were featured on NPR recently on Labor Day. And Rebecca, if you're able to find that NPR program on Aaron Copland from Labor Day, drop it into chat. Tell us a little bit about what Aaron Copland, the dean, so-called, of American composition, what he found in Mexico, what he found so enchanting, and why he was frustrated about the role of music in the United States. You started there, but go ahead.
I'm obsessed with this juxtaposition, and just to put my cards on the table, to me, Revueltas is a greater composer than Copland. The Copland story for me is a parable about the fate of the artist in the United States, because he wanted to be like Revueltas. He wrote a a workers' song for the new masses. He addressed a communist picnic in Minnesota. He did all kinds of things on the Popular Front. And he wound up being subpoenaed by Joe McCarthy and giving up on the new audience that he had hoped to cultivate. That was the fate of an American artist who attempted to make a political statement comparable to that of Revueltas. There's an even bigger picture here, which is the subject of the book that I've just written that comes out in November called Dvorak's Prophecy and the Vexed Fate of Black Classical Music. And this is a book that attempts to replace the story about American classical music that was told by Aaron Copland in tandem with Virgil Thompson and Leonard Bernstein, which leaves out people like Revueltas. It's essentially a modernist narrative in which Revueltas, like George Gershwin, like Charles Ives, is viewed with suspicion as a kind of gifted dilettante, somebody who's not fully schooled. And Copland knew the music of Revueltas. He even wrote about Redes in the New York Times. And like his friend, and they were friends, Carlos Chavez, who suppressed the music of Revueltas in Mexico, he very much felt that Revueltas was not a finished composer. So I think we have to throw out that narrative and start with a bigger, more inclusive narrative that begins with the sorrow songs. I believe that Du Bois and Dvorak were right, that that's a fundament for American music. It's been squandered by people like Aaron Copland and by American composers generally. So I really have a sharp axe to grind, I'm sorry to say, when it comes to these two stories, the Revueltas story and the Copland story, and what they tell us about the fate of music and culture in the United States.
So Joe, thank you. We're going to have more axes and grinding and music. Here is the book, by the way, out in November, as Joe said. The title is Dvorak's Prophecy and Vexed Fate of Black Classical Music. Let's go to Dvorak now, who was a European, a Czech composer who for part of his career, or a few years anyway, ended up in New York City. And I think we have something to listen to. Michelle? Thank you, Michelle. Joe, what are we listening to?
We're listening to Anhel conduct PostClassical Ensemble in something we concocted called the Hiawatha Melodrama. That is music most of us know. It's the opening of the Scherzo from the New World Symphony composed by Dvorak in New York in 1893. What most of us don't know is that Dvorak was greatly inspired by the Song of Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And the opening of the Scherzo is inspired by the dance of Palpakiwis at Hiawatha's wedding. And the reason it has bells is because Dvorak is noticing the bells on the moccasins of the dancing Indians. So the larger story here, which is one of the greatest and strangest stories in the history of Western culture, is that Dvorak, in his 3 years in the United States, 1892 to 1895, made an immensely influential and controversial prophecy. He said that what he called the Negro melodies would become the fundament for a future American classical music. And he also espoused the lore and music of the Native American. So when I say this is controversial, he was denounced in Boston as a Negrophile. And a lot of people thought he was crazy and provincial for imagining that Black Americans and Native Americans be considered emblematic Americans or representative Americans. So this story is as urgent today and as meaningful today as it was back then. And what you just saw was an excerpt from one of our films, one of the 4 post-classical ensemble films that's called Dvorak and the American Experience of Race, that will be released in November by Naxos in tandem with my book.
Joe, thank you. I'm going to ask you a question, Angel, and then I'm going to go back to you, Joe, on controversy, music then and controversy today. But Angel, am I right that there's a, what would you say, a quoting of sorts in the New World Symphony of music like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot?
Oh, of course. I mean, the slow movement, the beautiful slow movement with the English horn that I will mention later, that relates also to the Dawson Symphony. As Joe said, I mean, the New World Symphony is the example, the perfect example of Dvorak's prophecy that, or a statement that American music should look to the roots of African American music and Native American chants. So it's full of those quotations, the whole symphony.
So, Angel, thank you. And Joe, you alluded, you opened this up, so I'm going to continue just a little bit. In the foreword to your book, and it is a fine book, and congratulations, George Shirley, the operatic singer, the great tenor, says that the book is important for a number of reasons, including because we have been left so unprepared for the current cultural moment, close quote. What does he mean by that? Where are we? And how do we prepare ourselves? If we're late, better late than never. How do we prepare ourselves for the current cultural moment?
So George, who appears in our films and also in the festival we're producing in DC this season, and who's now vigorously teaching in his mid-80s at the University of Michigan, was the first Black tenor to sing leading roles to Metropolitan Opera in the 1960s. And he played a principal role in the desegregation of opera in the United States. What he's saying about our lack of preparation is really a way of reiterating what I said before, that the story that we've heard and we've always espoused about classical music in America is parochial. It essentially begins after World War I with the modernists. It doesn't have roots. It lacks a usable past, the very thing that Van Wyck Brooks and Lewis Mumford discovered in American literature, a usable past. Not only was it never discovered in American classical music, we were told, it was an article of faith, that there was no usable past, that there were no important composers of consequence. This omits Charles Ives, and it omits the American Dvorak and a lot of other people. But essentially what it omits is roots, whether it's transcendentalism or Native Americans or the sorrow songs. Classical music in the United States has been rootless, and that is the reason it remains Eurocentric to this day. So that's what George is talking about.
Yeah.
He says, we were not prepared for the current cultural moment. That's an understatement, I would say, when you look at what's going on with American orchestras to this day.
Well, Joe, there's so much I appreciate about the work of the post-classical ensemble, but even in the first 24, 25 minutes of this conversation, I appreciate greatly that you all search for connections, you have admiration for innovation, and you also respect tradition. These things are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, I'm going to make one note and then move on to Dawson. But my note is, you will have known these things, but in reading up a little bit for today's program, I was curious where Dvorak lived in New York, and I found, according to my sources, 327 East 17th Street, where, among other things, he composed the B minor cello concerto. And there's a little controversy in 1991,
right,
because Václav Havel, who I would call a kind of intellectual, spiritual patron of American Purpose, protested when the move was made to demolish the building. That protest fell on deaf ears. It became in 1991 his home, a medical facility for the treatment of AIDS patients, after which it became a homeless shelter. And there's a statue today of Dvorak history. It is rich and it is interesting. Let me move us ahead.
Can we just go back to that a moment?
Sure, of course.
That's in my book too. The New York Times supported this act of cultural vandalism. So did Isaac Stern. All the people who objected were Czech, because the Czechs have a reverence for the past and for tradition, which we as Americans do not always possess. And this destruction of Dvorak's house is another parable about the arts in the United States, I'm sad to say.
Joe, thank you. Michelle, we're going to go back to listening. And why don't you play first? We'll talk second.
So Jeff, we're playing Dawson next.
That's right. Correct. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Afro-American Symphony.
Sorry, we're having technical difficulties. One quick second.
Take your time.
And here we are.
So thank you, Michelle. Joe, you first. Who was William Dawson?
Well, first of all, who is Peter Bogdanoff? Peter Bogdanoff did that visual presentation, and I know he's in the room. He also is the person who culled the visuals for the Dance of Papakiwis that we saw earlier. And this is another excerpt from one of our films that will become available in November. We just heard the ending of the second movement of William Levy Dawson's Negro Folk Symphony, premiered in 1934. And when I titled my book, Dvorak's Prophecy and the Vexed Fate of Black Classical Music, one of the questions I'm asking is, how is it possible that we don't know this symphony? This to me is one of the most imposing symphonies ever composed by an American, composed by a Black American, premiered by Leopold Stokowski. When I'm getting chills down my back just telling you this story, when he premiered this in 1934, when the audience heard the ending of the second movement, the music we just heard, they began to applaud. And the applause was so sustained that the orchestra had to rise in the middle of this performance. It happened 3 times, twice in Philadelphia and once at Carnegie Hall, and still this piece didn't get played. And today it is still not being played. How is that possible? And Angel is about to conduct the DC premiere. Angel, how is it possible that this piece is not being played? Can you explain?
Well, it is impossible. And, you know, as somehow as an outsider and recent American since 2009, to me, this is inexplicable. I think this symphony is a revelation. It's very interesting that Dawson was born the same year of Sylvester Revueltas. Both were born in 1899. There is some destiny there in that year. Well, I think what we heard is the ending of the second movement, as Joe said. I think especially this second movement to me is really fascinating. I'm mystified still about it. I think there is a beautiful quote, a reminder of Dvorak's beautiful Largo in the New World. Actually, this moment to start with the English horn, the same instrument that plays that. But what we just heard, to me, I hear there a Native American chant. So what I think about this movement is that Dawson is actually giving us a great overview of American music somehow. So it starts with this beautiful lament, a plantation songs that somehow at some point even becomes, it has this, you heard the tenor drum there, so there is an extraordinary work of a counterpoint. There is a phenomenal middle section and very sophisticated orchestration. It's a masterpiece, really.
Jeff, you're muted.
Thank you both. Thank you, gentlemen. I want to move us along, not to rush, but I want to have time for questions. I mean, we need time for questions and comment from the gallery. So if we could go to Whitman, and we're going to hear something. And actually, let me bite my tongue and we will listen first, and then I'll ask and we'll talk. Michelle, back over to you.
A spear of grass. Once a child said, fetching the grass to me with full hands.
What is the grass?
How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than she. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition. Out of hopeful green stuff woven. I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer, designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or, I guess the grass is the beautiful uncut hair of graves. Tenderly, I use you, curling grass. It may be you transpire from the breasts of young men. It may be you are from old people. This grass is very dark to be from the white heads of old mothers, dark to come from under the faint red roofs of mouths. I wish I could translate the hints about the dead young men and women, and the hints about old men and mothers, and the offspring taken soon out of their laps. What do you think has become of the young and old men? And what do you think has become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life. All goes onward and outward. Nothing collapses. And to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier.
Thank you, Michelle. Joe, tell us what we're hearing, and then, of course, very importantly, from when. And then I know you think that this is work that has some relevance today.
I wonder how many people recognize the composer. It's Bernard Herrmann, and it sounds like Bernard Herrmann. He's the guy who composed the scores for Vertigo and Psycho and Citizen Kane. And Herrmann, in addition to being the supreme Hollywood composer, was the supreme composer for a genre forgotten today, which was the radio drama. This is a 1944 Norman Corwin radio drama called Whitman. It was part of the home front effort to bolster morale. The reader was William Sharp, and naturally that was Angel Gil-Ordóñez conducting PostClassical Ensemble from another one of our films, which will be released in November, which is called Beyond Psycho, the Genius of Bernard Herrmann. I consider Herrmann the most underrated 20th century American composer, and he does not fall within the standard narrative. He was not a modernist. People like Copland didn't take him seriously at all, but he's a major composer, not only of film music, but of radio music and of concert music. And our Herrmann CD on Naxos includes the Clarinet Quintet, which is my favorite American chamber work. We have revived this work, which was never intended as a concert work. It was like a 1944 radio show, in the conviction that orchestras should perform it live. And it's pertinent. If we have time for the next clip, which has to do with Whitman and democracy, which is the major topic of this radio drama, Whitman's ideal of democracy, you can't listen to Whitman talk about American democracy today without scratching your head so hard that it'll begin to bleed. And that's why I think that this radio drama has pertinence in the 21st century.
Oh, thanks. Michelle, do we indeed have one additional clip available?
We could, we have other Dvorak clip.
No, you have a second.
No.
You have a
We
second.
also have a second Whitman clip if you'd
That's
like
what
me to
we
play
want.
that. Okay.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, if you just give me one.
So if I start asking a question to fill the time, the music will begin, but I'll try to sneak one in. Herrmann's reputation, was it diminished because he was so active as a Hollywood
Of course.
film composer? Yeah, okay.
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
he was the victim of its own success. I mean,
Yeah.
nobody knew, he's absolutely known only for the music by Hitchcock, and his concert music is
Psycho and
more.
North
Exactly.
by Northwest, all that.
Yeah.
Michelle, you ready?
Yes,
Here we go.
These states
sorry. Share the screen. There we go.
are the amplest poem. Here is not merely a nation, but a teeming nation of nations. Here the doings of men correspond with the broadcast doings of the day and night. I announce the union more and more compact, indissoluble. I announce splendors and majesties to make all previous politics of the earth insignificant. This America is only you and me. Its power, weapons, testimony are you and me. The officers, capitals, armies, ships are you and me. The war is you and me.
So, Michelle, thank you. What I'm going to do now without commentary, I'm going to turn to our friends, our colleagues in the gallery and open up to questions. Joe and Angel, I will give you a chance before we close out to say something about the rest of the calendar year and the 2022 season for PostClassical Ensemble. But first, anybody in the gallery who wants to pose a question or make a comment, and if you could press the raise hand function, and when I miss you, because I tend to do that, Michelle will tell me who is there. Michelle, do we have anybody?
I don't see any raised hands right now.
I could start calling on people. How about that?
Yeah, we've had a few people in chat. Nicole Penn has her hand up now.
Nicole, please, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this lovely coda to our conference. So I have been wanting to ask Joseph about this particularly because I did have a chance to read your book in advance and I greatly enjoyed it. But I'm curious about the sparse references to William Grant Still, and if there was a reason that you didn't want to talk about him that much in your work, or if you agreed with Copeland's assessment of him, which I thought to be very unfair. Where do you think Still sits in the American canon?
I didn't want to talk about him for a reason, which is that he is the best known of these Black symphonists and was called the Dean of African American composers. But now that we've discovered Dawson and Det, I just don't think he's as good a composer as they are. And so we've shortchanged this music partly because we picked the wrong guy. And I would further speculate that what sets Nathaniel Det and William Dawson apart from William Grant Still is partly their milieu. What was Dawson's milieu? It was the Tuskegee Institute. What was Det's milieu? It was the Hampton Institute. They were both teaching at Black colleges, and they were both creating touring Black choruses of consequence, whereas Still was a guy who was involved in Broadway and Hollywood. And that's the difference that I hear.
So thank you, Joe and Nicole. And Rebecca, if you would find a piece by Nicole, not coming at it through the musical lens, but through the social historical lens on this very composer, William Grant Still, and you'll find that in the archives, so you can drop that in, that's great. Do we have another hand raised? And if not, I'm gonna call on somebody. Bob Asahina, you're a member of our editorial board, and you all know Bob as a writer, editor, public intellectual. Bob, where to start? Let me pick a spot. This body of work from Mexico that we started with, are you well familiar with that? Do you have your own ideas of why periods like this become neglected and then they also become revived? Because Joe has made the case why certain music has fallen out of favor or maybe never even got traction. But what does it take to identify great music and then bring it into the public consciousness and into the repertoire? Bob?
Mexico, I actually start by talking about New York. I'm curious, I haven't read Joseph's book, but I'm curious about the Czech migration And, you know, after Dvorak, there are people like Jaroslav Ježek who came to New York and spent 2 or 3 years here as an exile and then died, but was heavily influenced by the Black music that was being produced among jazz musicians at the time. And I'm curious about how the European and, excuse me, the native, if you want to call it that, Black tradition came together in places like New York and influenced music that in Ježek's case was certainly comparable to American composers, but is not nearly as well known. And I wonder if you had any comments on that.
Thank you. You just made me think of something I never thought of before, which is there's a bunch of these guys, like Martinu, the Czech composer Martinu, is already deeply engaged with jazz before he comes to the United States. And he's like a latter-day Dvorak. And then I also scribbled down the name Skoretsky. Joseph Skoretsky, do you know his book about Dvorak?
I know of it.
He's also a jazz guy. So there's something going on here that I don't know and understand. It can't be a coincidence that these Czechs, maybe
something about Czechoslovakia. I mean,
going on there, yeah, that makes them susceptible.
When you listen to Ježek, you know, you think, you know, why is he not known? And Gershwin is. I mean, his pianistic work was certainly as influenced by Black music and as evocative in a way that's startling.
The name. Can you spell the name for me, please?
Jaroslav, Jaroslav Ježek. I think I may be butchering the pronunciation. Jezek.
Thank you very much. There's something going on there because I don't know if you're aware. Do you know Martinu's music?
I know of it, yeah.
It's full of jazz. In fact, I even mentioned him in a footnote in my book because if Dvorak had lived to be 150, he would have turned into Martinu. Because and if he'd continued to spend time in the United States, Martinu is this same blend of jazz and Bohemian roots that you find in Dvorak. And I don't know enough about Martinu to know if he got there partly via Dvorak or what, but they're coming from the same place. And of course, Skoretsky is deeply engaged in jazz and also in Dvorak.
And I'm curious the process by which people like this wound up in New York.
Well, in Dvorak's case, it's very well known that he was just seduced by money. That Jeanette Gerber said, you know, are you going to come? He said, no, I'll give you more money. And she kept upping his salary until he couldn't resist it. He really had never thought to come to the United States, but he liked it. And the reason he went back is that her husband went bankrupt in 1893. And when the money dried up, because he had talked about retiring to Spillville, Iowa. So
I mean, in the case of someone like Ježek, the cause is much clearer. It was Nazism, since he was much younger. But again, the sort of entree of European culture coming to the United States and picking up these influences is a fascinating one, you know, regardless of Mexico. I mean, New York City alone, I think there's a great story to be told.
I actually have a book called Artists in Exile. That's the topic.
Great. I'll be happy to take a look at that.
So thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, Bob. I have one or two additional that I'll squeeze in. I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up. You can see why this is so good and so much better if we were together in person with a glass of something. One could go on, and we would. Let me call on Avi Tucker, who has some rich historical and cultural context, and then over to you, Fritz Heinzen. But Avi Tucker, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi. Hi, Jeff. I lived for 6 years in the Czech Republic. My wife is teaching Czech at Harvard, and it's Ježek.
Thank you.
Jazz was a symbol of freedom because the Nazis forbade jazz. So Skvoretsky was writing during the Nazi period. For him, jazz was anti-Nazi. And the Nazis even created one kind of this phony jazz band to sing anti-Semitic songs. And actually, Skvoretsky was for a while working with my wife, and he was sending her tapes of this Nazi jazz band. And then later, the jazz club within the artists' union under communism, in the communism, jazz was not illegal, but it was kind of Americanized thing. So that was a kind of freedom bubble within this communist dead culture, let's put it that way. With Martin was really an emigre to Paris. He got the jazz in Paris. Whereas Dvořák, what he did, I understand that he also went to Iowa for quite a while because the Czech migration was in Iowa. So what Dvořák did is he did the same trick that he did to the Slavonic music. That was, he upgraded it, gave it a high culture, because that was part of the Czech national struggle to prove that they were as good as the Germans. So they could also go and do the high culture and have their own orchestra and have their own music. And then Dvořák took these Slavic themes and he put them on the level of Schubert and Beethoven and so on. And that's why he was so significant to the Czech national movement. But people forget that what is Czech nationalism? Czech nationalism was to build the opera house in Prague, the Národní divadlo, the national theater. So for them, for all this Czech music and culture, it goes together. And the lovely thing is there's this cemetery in Prague where the greats of the nations, including Dvořák, are buried. And if you go there with a guide, they will show you where Dvořák is buried and so on. And you say, who is not here? And I would say, I don't know. And say, not a single general. No generals. There are writers, there are composers. That's the culture. That's what the nation means. But I took too much time. Had we been in DC, we would have gone for coffee now. But
well, one day. Thank you, Avi. I want to turn to Fritz Heinzen.
Can we just PS from Avi? This theme of jazz as a symbol of freedom, thanks for bringing that up, is huge in the Soviet Union. And I know Russian musicians who trained at the Moscow Conservatory who would listen clandestinely to the Jazz Hour on the Voice of America, who insist that Ella Fitzgerald and Oscar Peterson were far more important to them than they could possibly be to any American.
Thanks, Joe. Hey, Fritz Heinzen, we're going to work you in right now. If you could be brief, imagine it's a union orchestra, players are on the clock.
Very good. Okay, real quick. Love the discussion. My favorite forms of music, classical, jazz, soundtrack. We're hitting all the bases, so I love this. I'm going to quick throw out one name, Jan Hammer, Czech, who I think does some classical, but soundtracks, and for a lot of American TV shows. So the Czechs, they're always here, always contributing wonderful things. One thing real quick, and I want to get back onto the jazz because so many of the jazz musicians I know trace roots to classical. And so I'm wondering if you folks might be doing more in the way of jazz. I'm going to just throw out one name in jazz I find intriguing, and it's Ruth Naomi Floyd, who is bringing to life Frederick Douglass and his words and his legacy using jazz. And I'm just sort of curious if you've had any interaction with her. Thank you so much for a fascinating discussion this afternoon.
Anka, why don't you talk about David Taylor?
Yes, well, Fritz, thank you. I don't know, is she a singer? Is she a singer?
A composer and a musician.
Okay.
And she's at Frederick Douglass Jazz Works, I think. She has really got I think, a brilliant conception. I've enjoyed talking with her and so on. Really a neat idea. Let's use jazz. Let's get his words and his thoughts out there. So really intriguing idea. In fact, I'll look it up right now, but I think that's her website.
Well, we usually work with the craziest musician you can encounter in your entire life, who's a genius, whose name is David Taylor, who cannot be classified anywhere because he does everything brilliantly. And actually, we are preparing everybody that is in DC in January 19th, please join us at the Terrace Theater at the Kennedy Center for another experiment of PostClassical Ensemble, which is bringing this crazy guy to play Mahler. So
Bass trombonist.
on bass trombone, he's a bass
The
trombone.
world's most famous bass trombonist.
He's amazing. He has played with us. I mean, the most incredible rendition he ever conducted of Schubert lead is with him on the trombone instead of baritone on the trombone. So we do appreciate jazz. We love jazz, and with David has been always an extraordinary experience to work.
Okay, so you all listen, we've got the link to PostClassical Ensemble in the chat room. You can look there and see the beautiful lineup, the work that they have planned for the rest of this calendar year into 2022. I'm going to say a few words of thanks. This was a coda, so to speak, of a 3-day virtual conference marking 1 year American Purpose. And I have a couple questions, words of thanks, and then I'm going to invite Frank to say something in conclusion. A couple questions. Michelle is our managing editor. Sid Lipson, are you there too? Okay, so be on your toes. Michelle, just in 5 words, one surprise from the last 3 days?
Surprise. Seeing so many members outside our circle, so many new faces.
Okay, Sid Lipson, one thing that you encountered these last 3 days where you are eager to listen, learn, read more?
I thought this was a really wonderful session. Look forward to the next one and the next conference.
And Michelle, in all these sessions, one thing that just sticks out and you'll carry on and talk about at the dinner table or walking or shopping or playing tennis in the next week or two?
This and the arts program, just the highlights of stepping outside the debates and realizing how important the arts are to our everyday lives and to these debates.
So Michelle, thank you. Thanks, Sid. So there's so many people that make this venture possible. It really is an intellectual or ideas enterprise, but as you all know, it's really cause and community. So I thank the contributing editors and the editorial board, Frank Fukuyama, who is co-founder and chair of the editorial board. The writers and the funders have to be acknowledged. You know, look at the site and you see a very nice list of funders, and I appreciate every single one. But I have to tell you, you all might not know, or why would you know, we have a network of young writers who, they're a decent number by now. They will write for us. They will accept what we provide, which is really not a fee. It's a modest honorarium. And you know what they do? They turn around and unsolicited get on the page and make a financial contribution in an amount that exceeds the amount of the honorarium they've received. It's charming and endearing, and they don't ask for anything. It's inspiring, to say the least. We have a planning group that worked on this conference: Nicole Penn, John Lindbergh, Patrick Chamrell, Sidney Lipset, Chelsea Michte. We have this amazing team like Craig Kennedy, who's on the board and a senior fellow and advisor, and Michelle, our managing editor, Susie Garment, Michael Kennedy, our tech guru and web genius. And it looks beautiful, Michael. And you have worked so hard these last days. Sid Lipset, Chelsea Michte, our new editorial colleague, Rebecca Burgess. I have to single out, they're all important, but I have to single out, Michelle, you have made all the trains run, wow, hours and hours. And I always say in these things, if everything goes right, no one notices. If anything goes wrong, everybody notices. But really, Michelle, wow. While editing and publishing this week, by the way, and Sidney Lipset, you lead our cultural programs, but for this conference, your work conceptually, organizationally, indispensable, underscore, bolded, highlighted, deeply, deeply appreciated. All of you, and Michelle and Sid in particular these last days. Welcome Rebecca Burgess, who's a member of the team for about a week now, and we are thrilled you're going to lift our game and challenge us in many ways. And last and certainly not least, Francis Fukuyama. Frank, you, as the Germans say, dance on many weddings, and you're just back to California from DC, where you had a number of obligations. You got us started last fall with a brilliant essay titled Liberalism, Its Discontents, which you've turned into a book that will be published in April. You got us started on Monday with a discussion about the book, and also a terrific, lively interview with the mayor of Budapest. Interesting in more ways than one. I thought I'd call on you, Frank, to just share whatever observations you want to share and give us something to chew on. Take us forward.
Yeah.
Thanks, Frank.
Well, I'll just be very brief. I had to miss a lot of the second 2 days of the conference because I was in Washington actually to celebrate Carl Gershman, who stepped down after 37 years as the president of the National Endowment for Democracy. And there's a panel yesterday and then a much bigger celebration where quite a few members of Congress, including Nancy Pelosi, had some extraordinarily nice things to say about him. But Carl himself made a big point about, there's a crisis of democracy going on in the world right now. It's being attacked from both the right and the left. It's become a geopolitical issue. And the point that he was making was that this is not the first time it's happened. You have, an element of pure power involved with the rise of China and its economic and military might and so forth. But the real struggle is a struggle of ideas. And that was always something that underlay the Cold War and, the other large political events that we've lived through. And I think that, this is why we started American Purpose. We do believe that there are certain ideas that are important, that reflect values that I think most of the people that have been involved in these sessions share. But if you don't get them out, if you don't articulate them, if you don't reason with people, they're not going to win. And they've been, in retreat somewhat. So that's why we did this. And then I can't end without, so Jeff has thanked everybody in the world, but I have to thank Jeff because Jeff has brought incredible energy and organizational skill, doing it without, we wanted to give him $1 million contract for his first year, but we didn't quite have the resources to do that. So he's been running, this operation on a shoestring, but doing an unbelievable job at it. So Jeff, I want to thank you for the great first year, and hopefully we will have many, many more. So here's at it.
So Frank, thank you. Pleasure, privilege, you all. Thank you. And believe me, more very soon. And Angel and Joe, what a great hour spent. I mean, really, thanks. Fabulous, really fabulous. Thanks, Frank.
Okay.
Very kind. And Joe and Angel,
Thank you.
Godspeed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.